Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. As is our practice, we dedicate the learning, the zchut of our learning, to the safe return of our chatufim, our captives. I have a number of 124. The truth is, I don't know if that's right or not, because you keep hearing different numbers. So regardless of what the number is, we hope that they all come home safe and sound to us and to their families. We also hope that the zchut of our learning goes to the swift recovery and healing of our pitzuim, our soldiers who were wounded on the field of battle, certainly for the safety of our chayalim as they continue their mission on what could be the most dangerous part of the war, and a safety for Achenu B'nai Yisrael, Hanetunim B'tzarach, who are in danger really around the world. We hope that the Kadosh Baruch Hu protects us from our enemies and protects us from our friends. And we hope for a swift victory over Amalek, wherever they may be. So, I know that I have started the last two shiurim by saying that we will conclude our discussion of Sha'ar HaBitachon this week. Each week we get closer, but I promise you this week we're actually going to complete it. And I have, just to let you know, is that we have spent 7 or 8 shiurim on this topic. You can go online and you can see that people spend 25, 30 shiurim because there's much, much, much more to learn and to discuss. But today we will actually finish. Part of the reason that I wanted to spend so much time on it is that it is an essential building block to our growing our relationship with the Borei Olam. And in many, many ways, it defines the nature of our relationship with him. So far, we have discussed what is true bitachon, and we have presented scenarios how this bitachon has to manifest itself in our lives. And we mentioned areas like our health and well-being, on how we earn a living, how we should relate to other people. And we also spent a good deal of time thinking how we need to be certain and rely on the Kadosh Baruch Hu for this system of reward and punishment, both in this world and the next world, and saying that he will give to us what he promised, and really a schar, a reward beyond which we can imagine or to relate to. And we said that all of this is not based on blind faith, but on seeing in the world, in our world, God's presence and the chesed that he does for us every day. And so far, we have learned, just to recap, that we need to see God in this world, and that is foundation. And we spent Sha'ar HaYichud to try and understand God as a concept. We talked about Sha'ar HaBechina, that we should be able to look and to see the Kadosh Baruch Hu in our world, in everything that we do, and also to see the chesed that he does for us. And we have looked at Sha'ar Avodat Hashem, which talks about how our obligation to him is based on everything that he has done for us. Now, I don't like the word obligation, because the word obligation connotes that it's something we are forced to do, but don't want to do. But when somebody is as kind to us and important to us and gives to us as much as the Kadosh Baruch Hu, it really isn't an obligation. It is something that we should want to do, right? We should want to be able to give back, right? I mean, the example that I have in my mind is when the war broke out, we began to volunteer. 50% of us volunteered. And if you factor out soldiers and you factor out children and you factor out people who physically can't do it, that's everybody. and we wanted to do this. We couldn't give enough. We bought pizzas and ran down to Gaza as if the army needed pizzas. But the Gemara in Pesachim tells us that more than the calf wants to drink, the cow wants to give. It was that sense of outpouring that we should feel for the Kadosh Baruch Hu. So we have a mantra that we have developed for us to understand Bitachon, for us to want to trust the Kadosh Baruch Hu and to rely on him, right? And we said that we have to say to ourselves, and we have to integrate this into our lives, not as a function of blind belief, but to know it. One is that everything emanates from the Kadosh Baruch Hu, and everything is part of his plan. Everything he does, he has our best interests at heart, and he knows better than we know what our best interests are. Now, we know that we have a part to play. There is a hishtadlut, but ultimately, God is in charge. So, why don't we have this level of bitachon in the Kadosh Baruch Hu? Right? Why don't we really believe this and have this integrated in if we know it here? And we might say, well, it's obvious, but just because it's obvious doesn't mean it's easy. And we find that it's hard for us to really reach this level of bitachon, right? According to the Chovot HaLevavot, one of the manifestations of this lack of trust is we as human beings need guarantees, right? There's a Russian folk saying that says, dovirai no provirai. So for those of you who don't speak Russian, which includes me, it means trust, but verify, which means I trust, but I also want guarantees and proof, right? This phrase, just by the way, was made famous in the nuclear discussions between Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev back in the 1980s, that he said, we're going to trust the Russians, but we need guarantees, right? Okay, so this is, and although the chutzpah of this argument are apparent on its face, Ibn Bakuda uses this metaphor of requiring collateral, requiring guarantees from the Kadosh Baruch Hu, to show us the ludicrousy of us needing guarantees from the Kadosh Baruch Hu in order for us to trust him. So he gives out 7 different reasons, as his lists tend to be. So he says, first of all, it makes sense to ask for a security agreement from somebody who doesn't control you. Somebody who's in charge of you, asking them for guarantees doesn't make a lot of sense, right? I mean, the Kadosh Baruch Hu is in charge of us. He's the one who decides what happens. So to say, I want you to guarantee what you're going to do is foolish. He also says that given what he gives us, and given what we rely on him for, there aren't collateral, there aren't guarantees big enough to be able to justify asking for it. The other thing he says, and this is actually an idea that's interesting, we actually, in terms of who owes what, it goes the other way. We owe the Kadosh Baruch Hu, right, for what he gives us. For us to demand an assurity for somebody that we owe, I mean, think of it this way, right? If you borrow money from the bank, you don't ask the bank for the guarantee, right? The bank asks you for the guarantee, right? So asking the Kadosh Baruch Hu when he's continually giving us stuff. The other thing is, the reason for a guarantee is you don't believe that the person has the capacity to pay you. Right? So you're going to put your house up or your car up or whatever is collateral, because in the event that they don't pay, you're going to seize their property. Now, I used to be in the banking business, And there are 5 C's for lending, right? And it's character, capacity, capital, collateral, and conditions. The most important is character. Do you think this person is going to live up to what they say they're going to do? Right? So that's a hard argument to say that I need the Kadosh Baruch Hu to prove to me that he is trustworthy, that he has the capacity and the character to sustain us. So I'm going to skip over a couple, but the last one is that a person can only repay the Kadosh Baruch Hu with his help. So if we're asking him for his help so that we can, if we're asking for him to guarantee something that we can only look for with his help, doesn't make any sense at all. So what he's looking at saying, if you're looking for guarantees, you don't need them, and you really shouldn't ask for them. So there's a very famous trust exercise that's done. And that is where you either blindfold, close your eyes, stand straight, and fall backwards into somebody's arms. If you trust the individual, you will fall backwards. If you don't trust the individual, right, then you are going to either hesitate or you're not going to get involved with that exercise to begin with. And the principle brought about by the Chovot HaLevavot is the more you understand and appreciate God's greatness and power, the more you can feel his chesed and rachamim, the more you truly accept and understand everything he has done for you, the greater your level of Bitachon in the Kadosh Baruch Hu will be. So we have to ask ourselves the questions, are we in a position, and I'm not asking for you to answer this, but are we in a position where we are willing to fall back into the Kadosh Baruch Hu's arms or not? Do we really have that level of Bitachon in him, so to speak? So Ibn Pekuda says that Bitachon is developed. Right? It is not something that is innate, and it is a function of our life's experiences and our intellectual learning. And he goes on to list 10 stages of Bitachon. And he talks about the human development on how people develop trust as they grow and as they experience the world. So he talks about first as an infant, you rely and trust in what is closest to you. So he says, first, if you're nursing, you rely on your mother's ability to nurse. Then when you realize that it's not just her ability to nurse, but she's your mother, and you recognize your mother, and then you realize that your mother is part of a team with a father, and you shift your reliance and your trust into your family in general. You grow from your family to more reliance on yourselves, right? These are all physical things that you begin to see in your world. And then as you grow and you can think more abstractly and you understand the role of the Kadosh Baruch Hu in the world, you begin to rely on him more and more until you find the highest level, which is this level that we are talking about. So he says when he reaches the height of intellectual maturity, he will understand, meaning the individual, why he was created, how fleeting and ephemeral this world really is, and the importance not of this world, but Olam Haba. He says when this happens, that our focus in terms of what is important will shift from this world, and we will want to live in a world, this world, as a preparation for the world to come. So whether alone or in a crowd, our greatest joy will be in connecting and attaching to the Kadosh Baruch Hu. So we need to look at ourselves and we need to say, where on this continuum are we? Obviously, the first one we have passed, and the last one we aspire to. So we have to continually look at where we are in our relationship to the Kodesh Baruch Hu. So this ends Sha'ar HaBitachon, right? With us having a question to evaluate where we are. And he ends with a prayer. He ends up with a prayer after each Sha'ar, after each gate, but I think this is worth looking at. It says, Ha'Elohim yasimenu min habotim alav. May God make us to be amongst those who trust in him, who are a Baal Bitachon, who give themselves over to his judgment outwardly and inwardly, in his mercy. Amen. Okay, so I have fulfilled my promise. We have finished Sha'ar HaBitachon. So the next gate we pass through in Chovot HaLevavot, the next step that we need to take along the road to grow in our Avodat Hashem is to live our lives awake and aware. We need to look at everything we do and all the mitzvahs we do as dedicated to the Kodesh Baruch Hu, that we are doing these things because he asked us to and because we want to. So what does this mean? So if you look at source 2, it says, what is the devotion of actions to God? It's called Yichud HaMa'aseh, the unity of deed, which means focusing everything we have because the Kodesh Baruch Hu has asked us to do it. So he says, what is the devotion of actions to God? It is the intent in all revealed or hidden acts in the service of the Kodesh Baruch Hu to do them for his name, Lishma, because he said so, to attain his favor only, and not to do them to win over the favor of other people. Right? We need to have a constant reminder that each mitzvah we do, whether it is doing mitzvahs that he calls mitzvot of the limb, or feeling emotional mitzvahs that he calls mitzvot of the heart, and we do them for the sole reason that the Kodesh Baruch Hu commanded us to do, and that we want to do them. So Rabbeinu Yonah, who is the brother-in-law of the Ramban, wrote a Musar Sefer called Sha'ar Tshuva, the gates of making tshuva. And he tells us that being able to do this, to acknowledge the Kodesh Baruch Hu in every mitzvah that we do, is the height of how to sanctify the Kodesh Baruch Hu in this world. So this is what he says. Ki hadavar yadua. It is well known that among the ways to sanctify his name, may he be blessed, is to make known with every expression of the lips, with every hint of the eyes, and with every practice and movement of the hands, meaning all the mitzvot that we do, that the foundation of man's soul and his glorious adornment and the good and the essence and the purpose and the preciseness in it is the service of God. It is not just doing the mitzvot, but it is doing it with the intent. May he be blessed in fear of him. So the way this is expressed, this idea in the Gemara, is a question is, mitzvot tzrichot kavana or not? Can you do a mitzvah without this intent? Do you get credit for it or not? And the example that's brought, one example that's brought in the Gemara, and they ask this many, many times, is it's Rosh Hashanah. You are completely uninvolved with Yiddishkeit, and you happen to be walking behind a synagogue. You hear them starting to sound this horn, and it's interesting to you, and you spend your time and you listen to all 100 kolot. So the question is, the fact that you performed the mitzvah, because the mitzvah is to hear the kolot, did you really accomplish the mitzvah? Since one, you didn't know it was a mitzvah. Two, you didn't have any intent in terms of why you were listening to it. So is mitzvah performance alone enough? And the Gemara brings this in many places. So in this case, kavanah, intent, right, is two contexts. So the first one is, like I said, just performance versus not knowing. But what if you know that you're performing the mitzvah, but you're not really starting out by saying, I am performing this mitzvah because the Kodesh Baruch Hu wants me to do it, and I'm only doing it so I can fulfill his will, right? And the Mishnah Berurah says that if you don't have the second component, you really don't get credit for fulfilling that mitzvah. This is what he says. Some say, Yesh Omrim, know that according to what is explained by the halachic authorities, that there are two intentions for a mitzvah. The intention of the heart for the mitzvah itself, that's doing the mitzvot, and the intention to fulfill it, meaning one intends to perform it as God commanded. Meaning one, if I want to sit in the sukkah, and I want to fulfill the mitzvah, that's one level. But in order for me to really fulfill it, I have to go in and say, God wants me to sit in the sukkah, and that's why I'm doing it. And we hold this halacha. This is the halacha. And that we need these two types of kavanah. So this Rebbe Eliezer Melamed, right, has a number of books, but he called Penine Halacha, different pieces of halacha. He explains the reason for this. So I quote him. One can say that just as a person has a body and a soul, without one of them he cannot live. So too a mitzvah needs a body and a soul. The body is the action of the mitzvah, and the intention that accompanies this mitzvah is the soul. So if you think about a mitzvah without that intention is a body without a soul, which is a wonderful kind of insight. And many times we do our best to accomplish that. And one way we do that is we say something called Hineni Wuchanu Muzuman before we perform certain mitzvot, right? So recently, for the last 35 days, and you'll have to wait to find out what 35 plus 1 is, we say Hineni Wuchanu Muzuman Lekaye Mitzvat Aseh Shel Svirat HaOmer. I am prepared and ready to perform the mitzvah taseh, the affirmative command, to count the omer, right? I want to do this. And it says here, as is written in the Torah, and you shall count yourself from the day after the Shabbat, the second day of Pesach, from the day you bring the omer, that I am doing this because the Torah commands me to do it. That's the only reason that I'm doing it. That is my intent. Now, you might ask yourself the following question. Why in the world would you be chanting the Omer unless you had the intent to fulfill the Torah mitzvah? Right? I mean, it seems on the surface, nobody says to themselves, I've got a good idea. I want to now chant the Omer. No, it's a mitzvah and you have to do it and God told you. So Rabbeinu Bachya would answer that there are lots of reasons why people might perform a mitzvah. He said one could perform a mitzvah out of the desire to curry favor with an individual, or for honor, or he feels an obligation as opposed to a desire. So in New York, one of the communities that I belong to, they would have trouble getting a minyan. So when you get about 9, that's when you start making phone calls. And you will get people who will say, call me if you have 9 and I'll make the minyan, but outside of that, don't call me. So what does this mean? This means that the individual is going to daven, which is a mitzvah, not because he has an obligation to talk to the Kodesh Baruch Hu, but because he wants to help the community. And he wants the community to have a minyan. Now, that's good and it's important, but that's not fulfilling the mitzvah of davening. Fulfilling the mitzvah of davening is wanting to daven and become close to the Kodesh Baruch Hu because he wants to hear from you at least one time a day if you're a lady, and 3 times a day if you're not. Right? That's the reason you're doing it. And there are lots of other reasons you might. So the way the Chovot HaLevavot puts it is, the deeds that are perfected by devoting them to God alone while performing them are the acts of service whereby one hopes to find favor with God. These deeds, when he's talking about these deeds are all what he says the physical, the visible, right? Showing up to minyan, you can look to curry favor with other people or to do it for other reasons. The hidden mitzvot, the mitzvot of the heart, he says that you can only do that for your love of the Kadosh Baruch Hu, because there's nobody else who's going to see what you're thinking, what you're feeling, right? That's only the Kadosh Baruch Hu. So mitzvot like loving God, trusting God, and loving Klal Yisrael, and not hating, right, people, all of that, God is the only one who sees that. And although Ibn Bakuda doesn't bring up this idea, you can also perform mitzvot out of rote, meaning you're performing a mitzvot without really having any thought in it, right? Any connection to the Kadosh Baruch Hu. And I bring as proof no less than a philosopher than Tevye the milkman, right? Tevye the milkman tells us in the opening song tradition, he says, for instance, we always keep our heads covered and always wear a little prayer shawl, right? A talit. This shows our constant devotion to God. You may ask, how did this tradition get started? I'll tell you, I don't know. It's a tradition. We just do it. Why do we do it? I don't know. Right? But both of those things, wearing the kippah is a minhag, but wearing a talit is a dioraita, right? It's a Torah. He should say, we're doing this because God wants us to do it. I don't know. There are a lot of people who perform mitzvot out of rote, not paying attention. And sometimes we know the intention, but when we do them, we're not thinking, right? When you come into minyan, and I'm picking on people at minyan, but I mean the finger goes to me too, and you see people putting on their tefillin, sometimes it's like when you see ladies knit, right? Their hands are working, and they're just doing it automatically. It's hard to believe that they're sitting there saying, I'm being Mekayim, the mitzvah of tefillin, because the Kadosh Baruch Hu wants me to do it, and this is what connects me to it. I'm already 5 minutes late, and I have to get my tefillin on because they started davening already. And you walk in. That's not the way to connect to the Kadosh Baruch Hu, right? We need to be able to, each mitzvah we do, to say that we're performing a mitzvah. Now, one of the hardest mitzvot to do that with is living here. Every 4 steps you take, every 4 steps we take, is another mitzvah. So we should reflect that every step we take in this country, we are here because the Kadosh Baruch Hu wants us here. And we know that because we were born here. We came here because of that very reason. So it behooves us, as we walk to the grocery store, to think about how wonderful it is that we are here. We can take advantage of this mitzvah. Then we are walking here because Kadosh Baruch Hu has commanded us to do that. So he continues. He says that if you do it to curry favors with him, with the Kadosh Baruch Hu, then you are golden. Here's what he says in source 8. But for the duties of the heart, those are the ones we are talking about, there can be no hypocrisy, nor expectation of honor, respect, praise on accounting of fulfilling them, since other people cannot look into one's heart. Therefore, one's intent in feeling them automatically only goes to the one who's paying attention, the one who's the watcher, he says, namely the Kadosh Baruch. So he makes a very strong case. And then the question that he asked about Bitachon is the same question we have to ask here. Said it's easier said than done. How does one go about focusing their attention and being constantly aware that we are in service to the Kadosh Baruch Hu? So he gives us 10 steps to integrate this kind of God awareness into our lives. So I'm going to read them down, some of which we've covered from previous gates that we talked about at the beginning of this year. He says, one, to believe wholeheartedly in the unity of God. Gate one. God exists, God's eternal, God's indivisible, God's omnipotent. The few things we can understand about him outside of the world. Reflecting on the constant favors that God does for us every day, meaning to look in our world and to understand how our heart beats 24/7, right? Without that we breathe 24/7, without our having to do anything. It's a chesed the Kadosh Baruch Hu gives us. And we have to understand that this should make us want to serve him. That's Sha'ar Avodat Hashem. And as a result of this, which we just finished, we should place our reliance on him 100%. Right? He goes on and he says, we have to realize that help or harm is not in the hands of any created being. That's part of our Bitachon mantra. We need to be indifferent whether people praise or scorn us. In other words, we need to have a perspective in terms of the power that people have over us, whether it is to help us or to harm us, because ultimately they are just messengers for the Kadosh Baruch Hu. We need to quit trying to impress other people in a way to curry favor with them. We need to be able to make good choices, right? In terms of what is really important in this world and what is not really important in this world. Right? A lot of times as we get older, we realize things that we thought were very, very important are not very important. Right? Having a lot of the material things of having the latest and the greatest, you get to the point where you say, it's really not that important. There are much, 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 much more important things. We need to be able to fear God and to feel embarrassed from him. We'll talk about that later. But it is a sense that when we look at our behavior vis-a-vis what we truly owe him, it should cause us to feel a little embarrassed if we're not doing what he wants us to do, given everything that he's done for us. When I was back in New York, I went apple picking and I lost my wallet. And I didn't replace my driver's license because in New York, to get a new driver's license is a full day's activity, right? You have to just sit and to wait, and it's like the people there are on Thorazine. It just takes forever. So I didn't do it. It happens I was pulled over, and the police officer said, show me a license. So I explained to him about the apple picking and the Bureau of Motor Vehicles. And he said, I see you have all your credit cards. I said, yeah, well, with credit cards, I can call them and they send it to me. And I said, but sitting where I'm sitting now, that was a pretty poor choice, right? We're going to have to stand in front of the Kadosh Baruch Hu, and we're going to have to think about our choices and see if we can really come up with justifications or simply say, that was a bad choice. That was a bad choice in terms of what we did. The other thing that he's going to talk about, that we're going to start today, is that we have to be careful against something called the Yetzer Hara. And I know that when you hear those words, your eyes roll up into the top of your head and say, well, is there really a Yetzer Hara? And we have all sorts of ideas about it. But it's something to be taken very seriously. And in fact, the Chovot HaLevavot is going to be dedicating an entire chapter that we'll get to probably next week about what this is and what we should be concerned about. If this is what we need to do, then the question is, why is it so hard? Why aren't we being more successful in it than we are? And what the Chovot HaLevavot brings as how what seems to be pretty obvious, because he gives us the 10 things that we really need to do. But if it is obvious, then why don't we do it? Or at least, why don't we do it consistently? What are the barriers that we really need to overcome? And herein emphasizes 3 things that are working against us. 2 of them we have covered in earlier Shiurim, in the beginning gates, and 1 is relatively new, right? And we're going to focus on that, or at least new for our discussions here. So the first 2 barriers are simply that we really haven't done our homework for the first 4 gates that we have covered. We haven't really integrated the knowledge of the Kadosh Baruch Hu, the chesed of the Kadosh Baruch Hu, everything he has done for us. We have not integrated it from intellectual knowledge to emotional knowledge. And as a result, we in many cases treat him as an abstraction, right? Nothing that's really part of what we think is important in our day-to-day physical lives. So the way Ibn Pekuda states it, he says, ignorance of God and his good, meaning all the chesed that he has done for us each and every second, right, doesn't really make us feel that we're obligated to him, right? He also says ignorance of mitzvot and his Torah, meaning either we don't know what the mitzvot are or we can't be bothered in doing with what he has told us to do. And he brings a 3rd element, which is what he said before. He said thoughts and suggestions that the Yetzer Hara presents to a man to endure him to this world and to distance him from the path that leads to his good in the next world, plays a large part on the choices that we make, because all of this is based on choices that we have. Right, so he's going to talk about Yetzer Hara, but he defines it here as the urge for us to choose physicality over spirituality, gashmiut, physicality now in terms of what we enjoy in this world, over ruchnius, and over the pleasures of the world to come. Some of it are choices that we have to have immediate pleasure, as opposed to waiting until we get to Olam HaEmet. I mean, the adage in today's world is that immediate gratification is not fast enough, right? That we need something now. He says that ignorance of the law is no excuse. Before we delve into the last item, that Rabbeinu Bafia wants to reinforce that the fact that you haven't done your homework, the fact that people haven't done their homework, accusing anybody, doesn't give you a patur. It doesn't give you a free pass, right? He assumes that we are doing the mitzvot, but not necessarily for the right reasons. So what's the wrong reason? Doing it for the right reasons. We're doing it and ascribing the power of the Kadosh Baruch Hu and the gratitude we should owe him to people. The person who shows up to the minyan because he wants to make the minyan for the other 9 guys means that the obligation for him to daven is based on either his desire to help these guys or how they're going to think of him or maybe reward that he will get from them, right? So this whole idea of davening for this individual is now not based on the Kadosh Baruch Hu. He's saying that the reason I do mitzvot is for other people. The reason I have a sukkah is maybe because I want to invite people in, and it's a wonderful thing, and maybe I enjoy the festivities. But the reason you're sitting in the sukkah is because the Kadosh Baruch Hu wants you to sit in the sukkah, right? Now, all of those other things are side byproducts that you should enjoy it, and he made it to enjoy, right? I never really enjoyed Sukkot as much as here, because it makes sense here as opposed to sitting in New York with mittens and watching the rain fall into your soup, right? And he wants us, his man simchatenu. But ultimately, the thing that keeps me sleeping on my son-in-law's porch is because the Kadosh Baruch Hu wants me to sleep on the porch. That's what he's told me to do. He says that if you don't have this kavanah, if you have this kavanah for other people or other sorts of rewards, he says it actually puts you in a very bad place. He says that someone like this is a mechanef. And Ibn Bakuda says that a mechanef, which translates as a flatterer, we'll explain that in a minute, he says, quote, is the greatest disease in the world. He is called in our writings the flatterer, the haughty, and the enticer. In fact, he says, if somebody is a mechanef, he is worse than somebody who is an oved avodah zarah. Somebody who's a mechanef is worse than an idolater. So it begs a question, which is, what's a mechanef, right? So let's take a moment to figure out what this isser of a mechanef, why he is so terrible. Now, the truth is, Rabbeinu Bafya understands this term mechanef a little different than is usually thought of. So let's put it into the context how it's usually brought. So the Torah tells us in Sefer Devarim, right, Lo tichanfu et haaretz asher atem ba. You shall not pollute. You can see this word mechanef, in the land in which you live. For blood pollutes the land, and the land can have no expiation for blood that is shed on it, except for the blood that of the one who shed it. And the Ramban quotes this, counts this as one of the 613 mitzvot. And from the verse that I just read, the pasuk I just read, is it clear to anybody what this is? No. I mean, I can read it again. You shall not pollute the. So what is? You shall not pollute the land in which you live, for blood pollutes the land, and the land can have no expiation for blood that is shed on it, except by the blood of the one who shed it. So what is this mechaneh? This is how our rabbis understand it. Sefer Yereim says that the proper definition of chanifa, that's the sin, is perverting the truth by flattering somebody who is doing something halachically wrong. Let me explain. So first of all, Sefer Yereim, for those of you who may not be familiar, is an important work. It was written by a Rav Eliezer ben Shmuel of Mentz in the 12th and 13th century, and it is one of the earliest codifications of Jewish laws and customs, right? It came right after the period of the Geonim. So what a mechanef is anytime we choose to let a sinner, somebody who's committing a sin, that for some reason it is not so bad. So if you see somebody, Rahman al-Tzlan, who's being Mechal Shabbos, and you say to them, well, you know, being Mechal Shabbos isn't the worst thing in the world, or telling them what you did was fine. Perverting what it says in the Torah in order to make somebody else feel better, or to get some sort of return on it, because you want them to do you a favor, you want them to think about you better, right? And those two things, either making somebody who is being over Aveira in the Torah, making him feel better about that Aveira, or telling them that it's not an Aveira and it's okay for you to do that. So in other words, Chanipa is in essence a deception, right? But it's a deception that occurs when somebody encourages the performance of Aveirot and when somebody fraudulently misrepresents something as being in the Torah when it is not acceptable behavior, right? The base case of Chanifa is when you know, like I said, somebody has sinned and you say, it's okay. So according to the Gemara in Masechet Sota, a person who violates the prohibition of Chanufa or Chanufa is one of the 4 groups of people she'ein mekabel pnei hashchina, that the Kadosh Baruch Hu doesn't want anything to do with. And they will not be welcomed by the Kadosh Baruch Hu, and they will not be accepted in his divine presence. Wow. So now you have to ask yourself the question, what is the reason behind this prohibition? And really, there are 2 reasons. One is on the individual and the impact it has on the individual, that we have an obligation as a people to ensure that we all keep the mitzvot. We have a mitzvah of tochacha, that under the appropriate conditions, and what those conditions are is a shiur for a different time, we are supposed to help be makarev people so that they perform the mitzvot. And when we do chanufa, we are doing the opposite of tochacha. We are enabling the offender to continue in doing what he's doing, which is wrong. And we are also taking away from them the ability to do tshuva. Because if they don't think that what they're doing is wrong, then there's no reason for them to do tshuva. It also impacts on the individual who is the mechanef, because he creates chilul Hashem. What he's saying is that this individual is more important than the Kadosh Baruch Hu. The feelings of this person, I need to protect more than what the Kadosh Baruch Hu wants to do in this world. Now, again, this doesn't mean we need to be strident, but this means that we need to be principled. So he also said that the impact is on the Kadosh Baruch Hu, because if Kadosh Baruch Hu says to do X, and you go around telling people that it's not X, it really should be Y, right? You're falsifying the Torah, and you're saying that the entire Torah isn't true. So in the context of the Chovot HaLevavot here, once you ascribe the power to man and trying to curry favor with man as your reason for doing the mitzvot, then you are perverting the Torah itself. And as a result, that's why he thinks that this individual would be a mechanef. So now you're going to ask me the question, okay, so why is this worse than being Oved Avodah Zarah? I mean, understand that we have 3 mitzvot of Hareg V'al Yavor. There are 3 things we're supposed to let ourselves be killed rather than do. And this is, according to the Chovot HaLevavot, worse than that, right? I mean, is that really up there? And he says, however, the idol worshiper is to be preferred over the flatterer, which he calls the hypocrite, or at least the translation here is the hypocrite, in the following 4 ways. In our times, there are no prophets which can perform miracles to clarify to the idol worshiper his faulty outlook. In other words, there's no way to tell this Oved Avodah Zarah what is the right path. But the flatterer, the mechanef, is in God's Torah, there are grounds for a claim against him, for he understood the commandments to serve God alone, and he undertook the prohibitions not to serve anybody else, meaning man. The idolater, the Oved Avodah Zarah, worships something which does not rebel against God, meaning that he may worship trees, but he's not worshiping trees as a way to deny the existence of God. He's worshiping trees. But the flatterer in God's Torah worships a human being who rebels against God as well as one who does not rebel against him, right? I mean, he's doing this for either somebody who's from and accepts the Torah. He's just allowing somebody else to take the place of the Kadosh Baruch Hu. It says the Oved Avodah Zarah worships one thing alone, whereas the flatterer, there's no limit to those he worships. So he worships trees, and the other worships you, and then this, whatever it is that is to his advantage. And fourth, he says that the idolater status is visible for all to see, right? Everybody knows he's an Oved Avodah Zarah when he worships his tree, and people guard themselves from him due to public knowledge of his denial of God's existence. So if somebody is a public Oved Avodah Zarah, everybody knows it, and everybody's on guard, and everybody can be watchful against it. But the flatterer, the Mechanef, denial is not visible, right? They think that he's a frum Yid, and people trust him. Therefore, he is most likely to damage them than the idol worshiper. Just as a side, equating being a Mechanef with being an Oved Avodah Zarah would seem to imply that if you had a choice of being a Mechanef or not, that you should rather give up. Somebody gives you the foolish choice. I don't know how this would work. Be a Mechanef or die. You should say, die. Like the Isur against Avodah Zarah or Hilui Arayot, right? Having impermissible relationships, or Shvichut Damim, or murdering somebody. And the truth is, Rabbeinu Yonah says under certain circumstances, yeah, Chayav Adam limsor et atzmo l'sakana ve'al yasi et nafsho avon hashama kazot. And the person is obligated to give himself over to danger, right, and not place guilt upon his soul. Now, Rabbeinu Yonah has 9 different categories, and the category he's talking about is if you are in front of somebody very powerful and you have the opportunity to kind of appease him when you see him eating his ham sandwich on Yom Kippur, driving his car and telling him, yeah, it's okay. You are obligated, not everybody agrees with this, you are obligated to incur whatever wrath you might have and not do this. But our takeaway from all of this is how serious this Avera is of not putting our full concentration on the Kadosh Baruch Hu and allocating the reason for our mitzvah performance to other people. And we should keep that in mind as we perform our mitzvot, and have a tick list to say, okay, I need to remember that when I perform this mitzvah, I am doing it for the sake of the mitzvah and for the sake of the Kadosh Baruch Hu. I have now an introduction to the Yetzer Hara. We're going to handle most of it next week, but I think I'm not going to do that because I have a lot to say, and I don't want to take up too much time, but I will want to do this. One of my favorite movies, and I know I like to quote a lot of movies. One of my favorite movies is a movie called The Usual Suspects. It was a great movie with Chaz Palminteri and Kevin Spacey. There's a tagline in the movie that says, the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. We have a tendency to play down this idea of Yetzer Hara. And sometimes we use it flippantly, right? We say, when we have an overwhelming desire for something, we say, I have a tremendous Yetzer Hara for this and so. And we find it difficult to accept its existence or its power. And it's not just us, right? It's a very, very common thing. In fact, even Rabbi Akiva himself belittled the power of the Yetzer Hara. The Gemara in Masechet Kedushim tells us the following: Rabbi Akiva have mitlotzetz be'ovrei avera. He was making fun of people who commit averot because he was at such a spiritual level that he felt that it would be easy to overcome this Yetzer Hara, and he didn't give enough credit to the Yetzer Hara. Yom Echad, one day, Yom Idmi le Satan, Hid'itra bereish dikla. One day, Satan, the Yetzer Hara, it's interchangeable in Talmudic literature, appeared to him, to Rabbi Akiva, as a beautiful, enticing woman sitting on the top of a dekel, a palm tree. Rabbi Akiva was so overwhelmed with his desire for this woman that he started to climb the palm tree to reach her. When he got halfway up, the Satan says to him, when he was halfway up the palm tree, the Satan, the evil inclination, left him, right? Meaning that he no longer had the desire. And he says to him, were it not for the fact that they proclaimed about you in heaven, were it not that the Kadosh Baruch Hu was looking out for you particularly and saying, be careful with regard to Rabbi Akiva and his Torah, I could have had your blood like this. Right? Don't underestimate the power of the Yetzer Hara, no matter at what spiritual level you are. And the Chovot HaLevavot is talking about the power of the Yetzer Hara to influence our Avodat Hashem and to put in front of us choices, appealing choices, false choices, as alternatives to what the Kadosh Baruch Hu demands of us. Right? So what he is saying is that in addition to ignorance or not learning our lessons well, the Yetzer Hara presents us with alternative, plausible explanations to prevent us from seeing the true picture of the world and the Kadosh Baruch Hu's role in our lives. As a result, succumbing to what Ibn Pekuda calls the temptation of the Yetzer Hara, and it prevents us from truly dedicating our actions to the Kadosh Baruch Hu. He says that these temptations of the Yetzer Hara, right, divide into two categories. And they're as follows. Thoughts which cast doubt on the truth and confuse our emunah so that he cannot do any religious act. Doubts that we have that creep into our minds as about the existence of God, the validity of Torah. He says he comes in the way of arguments and proofs that his zeal and exertion in the service of God is neither a duty nor meritorious, and he advises him instead to work for this world and its inhabitants. We live in a world where these arguments are about us everywhere, in every meeting. Right? In the United States, at least, if you are religious, you're treated as odd, because normal, intelligent people wouldn't be religious. I remember going to wasn't a lecture, it was a debate with Christopher Hitchens, who was a famous, now he's dead, famous atheist. And he equated believing in God like believing in fairies. And you hear in the media, in the United States, if you're religious, they use derogatory adjectives, right? They call Christians fundamentalists. They call Jews who are Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox, right? It's not like you're normal people who really don't believe this, but you're somehow odd. And it's hard to confront this. And that's all the Yetzer Hara that's around us that tries us to convince us that we shouldn't do what we know we should. How that works, some of the background. Thank you very much.